Hello everyone, welcome back to another review, and this time we are talking about the New Teen Titans Volume 4. First off, apologies for not being on camera, having a bit of technical issues at the moment, but even so, this should be alright. I do actually have the paperback with me, but there's nothing here that I necessarily want to show off to the camera as far as art is concerned, so audio should be alright covering some of this. So Volume 4 of the New Teen Titans goes through numbers 21 through 27 and has the New Teen Titans Annual number 1. That annual is actually the final issue in the second story arc of this collection, back when most Marvel and DC used to do this a lot, where you'd get a 3 or 4 issue long story arc, and then the annual would tie everything together, and then the next issue, the main book, would be a new ongoing or a new story arc of some kind, and it made for some really confusing things. If you just go from Iron Man number 32 to Iron Man number 33, there's no conclusion to that story. Volume 3 Iron Man, that is. But whatever, you have to read the annuals. It at least makes them worth something, as opposed to what we get now, where they're just kind of fill-in stories. So Marv Wolfman opens this particular collection talking about the evolution of this book, and he doesn't say too much that we haven't already heard in regards to how long this book has run, but he does talk about their mentality going into this particular set of issues, because he addresses the numbering as if it's an actual age. So, issues 1 through 10 is this book as a child, and then issues 11 through 20 is this book as a teenager and trying to find its ground, and then issues 20 forward is what he considers the book to finally grow up. His exact words were something along the line, well, actually, here it is. His exact words are, "We were now in our 20s and we knew if we wanted to survive, we couldn't keep doing the same thing yet again, but we had to grow up. We had characters our readers liked, so George and I decided to go for broke and start pushing them in ways we hadn't previously dreamed possible. We dropped the one-issue stories and went to longer, more complex tales. We also introduced a number of new villains whose origins and motivations were very different from the norm of the day." And that kind of describes this particular collection in a nutshell. It actually describes everything about this book going forward. The New Teen Titans, after a point, becomes kind of stale, but this is what I would consider the beginnings of what people know the Teen Titans for. I think if anyone's ever told you about the quality of this run, they're talking about what started with this volume. Now, it's separated into 3 particular story arcs, and they all tie together a little bit when it comes to what's going on at the culture of the time. But overall, they're 3 separate stories, so we'll go ahead and talk about each one and maybe connect some of those dots. The first 2 issues, numbers 21 and 22, introduce Brother Blood. And Brother Blood, the way Wolfman talks about him, is that he's inspired by this notion of evangelical religious people and televangelism and that kind of thing. What Marv Wolfman was kind of annoyed about was this idea of pushing religion as media and propaganda. That he didn't like this idea that religion had sort of devolved into sensationalism and into complicated dogma for the sake of perpetuating a certain mindset. And what he wanted to do with Brother Blood is to try and personify a lot of that. And so he created this personality that's very Billy Graham-esque before Billy Graham. Well, I guess Billy Graham probably would have been doing things at this time. Where he's kind of soft-spoken, but in places he's bombastic, that he's hearty, that he's got control in both political and private interests, that he's become this sort of symbol for a cult following, despite the fact that they're preaching a religion or claim to be preaching a religion. And Brother Blood's powers of mental manipulation haven't really come up yet. There's nothing here about him being able to control people's minds. It's actually all about this idea of people having nowhere to go, or people being afraid to question things. And so that fear and some of that doubt gets personified through Brother Blood and his sort of ability to twist people's internal feelings about things. Like, for example, someone mentions that your name is Brother Blood. Obviously, there's something dark there that people would naturally be afraid of. And he says, no, Brother Blood has nothing to do with evil. It's all about lifeblood and the glowing liquid that forces all of us together, that binds us, that makes us human. And it's just this full of crap spin on something to make him seem more malevolent than he is. And this book is filled with that. There's a lot of moments here where the Titans are starting to anchor themselves, and they've gotten much closer after the Tales of the Teen Titans mini. And so now they really do feel like a family, and at the same time, they're drawing to each other because they all come from so many broken households and so many more complex problems that not any one of them can solve. Starfire being a slave, Robin coming off of a relationship with Batman, Changeling having all these parental issues, Cyborg going through the stuff with his parents, his appearance, and Sarah Sims, the girl that he's been trying to see and hasn't talked to until now. All of these characters are dealing with issues that not one of them can handle by themselves, and so through their working together, they kind of collectively come up with a sort of more anchored personality, that they are Teen Titans, that they do come together for some ideology. And so there's a good way to make that mentality work. There is a good way to perpetuate a culture that comes from not a hive mind, but like a collection of thought as opposed to radical individualism. And then the opposite side of that is more of the televangelist, religious cult mentality of just perpetuating what one person wants and spinning it as if it's for the greater good. And a lot of that's really interesting. And the way they're able to make a lot of this work is that Brother Blood has people inside the government and in the media, and he's set up the situation where when the Titans attack him, he's got a news reporter there reporting as the attack is happening and making it seem like the Titans are there attacking Brother Blood unprovoked and just hurting and killing innocent people, which is not the case at all. But Blood is able to spin it that way. Blood is able to make it seem like he's died and then come back to make it seem like he is this real, true religious icon, and he's not. And it's really fascinating stuff, and the way he presents himself with this red and black costume and the white draped over him, the death and resurrection, this imagery of everyone dressed in black and red, everyone having everyone like standing in circles around him always being towering over everyone, his sort of, as Robin mentioned at some point, soft-spokenness to the point where if you weren't boosting audio, you wouldn't be able to hear what he's saying, that kind of thing. It's really interesting. And there's a point here where the Titans get captured, and Blood just has Robin tortured for hours on end to try and get information out of him, and Robin doesn't give, and a lot of that goes back to his training with Batman, and then the Titans get thrown inside of this pit where this giant spider-fanged creature is attacking them, and Robin has to single-handedly save all the Titans while they're all unconscious, and he's just been thrown into this pit after being tortured for days on end. So it's really putting these characters through the ringer. It's really punishing them, but it's also talking a lot about the danger of that kind of hive mentality, talking a lot about the danger of giving yourself over too much to one person. And Brother Blood actually has a lot in common there with Raven, who she's going through a lot of these battles, and she's trying to absorb people's pain because she is an empath. And some of that comes more to the foreground when we get to the later Blackfire story arc. But it begins here, and it's seated here, and there is this notion that Raven's incapable of being anyone outside of what her father has cornered her into, outside of what Trigon wants for her, and her adamant denial of that she doesn't have an identity that is independent of that resentment. And blood is that mentality. Blood is that letting someone control your emotions in that way, and letting someone define for you what is right and wrong, what's good and bad, and spinning it to make you let yourself wiggle out of discomfort. What's interesting about Blood's rhetoric and what people cling to with his words is that when they're with him, they don't ever have to feel uncomfortable talking about anything. And with that there, Blood's able to perpetuate a culture that worships just him because he's not challenging them at all. That he is kind of a intellectual parasite that's dulling their critical thinking. And a lot of this is targeted towards cults and targeted towards televangelism and such. So I wouldn't want anyone to take this story as anti-religion, because I don't think it is. At the same time, though, I think it is a pretty strong critique of religion utilized poorly, because a common misconception with just religious conversation in general, religious versus atheistic conversation, is that people dismiss religion offhandedly, saying that you don't need religion in order to have morality. And you're right, you absolutely don't. At the same time, though, religion is more than that. Religion involves a certain kind of aesthetic and a certain kind of ritual and a certain kind of social dynamic that goes beyond the bounds of morality. And so this critique that Wolfman's presenting isn't anti-religious in nature. It's anti-cult and it's anti-televangelism and it's anti-dogma, if it's anything. So don't take this as a raving attack against religion the way something like Preacher and Garth Ennis' Hellblazer are. And even then, the arguments are more nuanced than simply an attack on morals. So the Royal Blood story is fantastic. I really love what's being done there. And then you move forward to the next one, which is this 4-issue epic about Starfire being captured by Blackfire and being taken back to Tamaran. There's a moment here in the opening where the Titans are called into the district attorney's office to talk about this attack on Brother Blood's temple. And the Titans very clearly understand that they screwed up, not because something was really their fault, but because the media was able to spin their attack the wrong way. But the district attorney says that, no, you did screw up because we had Brother Blood, we were monitoring him, but now you've turned him into a martyr. And so there are more factors at play here, and this district attorney reminds me a lot of Dark Knight's version of Harvey Dent. His name is Adrian Cross, by the way, which is on its own a really cool name. But Adrian Cross is very much this golden boy of politics that has like a mean streak, and I really like that. And I like that it's not just blanket statement, one-sided politicism or anything like that. I think that's interesting. But as that's happening, the Gordanians, led by Komandar, which is Starfire's sister Blackfire, show up to take Blackfire. And there's a bit of an explanation for why they didn't show up sooner. We won't really bother talking about that. But they capture Starfire, and they're going to take her back to her homeworld, which is now under the control of this other race that's been conquering all 22 worlds in the vegan system. And so the Titans are going to go after her, and in they're going after her, they lose their spaceships, and they run into Superman on the Watchtower, who sends them with the Omega Men to help get Starfire back, because at this point Superman has lost half of his powers. That's a whole other thing that we won't talk about. So the Titans go after Starfire, and we'll talk about some of that in more detail. I do want to mention, though, that Marv Wolfman, as he's talked about in this introduction, loves puns. He thinks puns are the greatest thing ever, and the worse, the better. Like, for some reason, he's just got this thing for puns. So the vegan system, however you pronounce it, is clearly just a spin on the word vegan. And Starfire's name is Coriandar, but it's a spin on the word coriander, because it's a spice, and he considers Starfire like a spicy character, like a character with some bite to her. Blackfire's name is Komandar, and because she's militaristic and always wanted to be in charge, it's a spin on the word commander. And then their dad is Mayander, who is a guy that's always going off in the wrong direction or doesn't really know how to lead. And so Mayander is a spin on the word meander. And that's kind of hilarious. But I did want to just throw that in there. Now, I'm adding like a bit of an accent to the way those words are pronounced, because the way Wolfman talks about them, their names are just Commander, Coriander, and Meander. He would literally say that's how you pronounce them. But I think that sounds stupid, so I'm just going to try and put the R sound on there and deal with the absent letters a bit more, just so I'm not calling Starfire Coriander constantly. So the Titans are going after a Starfire who's been captured by Blackfire, and there's some really interesting stuff at play here, where Starfire and Blackfire have a relationship that's very antagonistic. There's no moment here for Blackfire and Starfire where they're like, maybe we can reconcile and maybe we can let the bonds of sisterhood get us back to a sound footing. Starfire is having none of it. Starfire doesn't care what's going on. Starfire doesn't care about salvaging a relationship at all. She is very adamant about the fact that if I get out of these chains, I will kill you. And there's a lot here with Starfire being a slave at one point, losing her family, and being trapped on a world, not knowing whether her planet has lived or died, whether her family is alive or dead. And so she's got this very adamant need to make sure she's never bound again, that she's never in chains again, that she's never forced to submit in any way. And so to have her go on that kind of rant in the Tales of Teen Titans issue and in the earlier issues of this, and then to see her trapped by Blackfire is interesting. And so there's a lot more punishment, I think would be the best word, for the characters as this particular story goes on. I mentioned earlier that Robin gets tortured by Brother Blood, and Starfire gets the same treatment here, maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, where it seems like Blackfire is just taunting her constantly and charging up her black fire bolts in her face and things like that. And so there's very much more psychological torture going on there than physical. And all the Titans kind of have that going through this story. As the Titans and the Omega Men are attacking this alien horde, Raven's going around not understanding all this violence and just constantly trying to heal everyone. And in doing that, she's not able to expel the pain the way she normally would because there's just so much information going in at once, and that's causing her to overload, and it's causing Trigon to slowly awaken in her, which terrifies her. And because she doesn't talk to anyone about it, there's lots of moments here where the Titans are wary of taking her into battle because they're not sure if they can trust her to be open with them or trust her to deal with what's going on. And then ultimately that this kind of pain is going to break her down. There's some really interesting stuff done with Raven in the final story arc that we'll get to in a second. So the Titans and the Omega Men attack, and so there's just this big brawl, all-out brawl between aliens, and we finally get some explanation for what Starfire calls out to every time something goes wrong. She always says like Exhal, X''HAL, which is kind of like Odin's beard, by God kind of phrasing, but it's noted here that it's always uttered in a sense like revenge, so it's not necessarily godly as much as it's kind of devilish. And we get an explanation for who that is. And Exhal is apparently this person in the star system that has godly power, that used to be this kind of radiant military leader that freed all of these people. And then because of how peaceful their society became, they were attacked unexpectedly. And so she was killed, but then through testing on her body, she gained this unlimited form of energy and power. And so now she is like this kind of ultimate god of destruction, god of creation, that's trapped on one particular planet, because if she ever leaves, her power is going to be too great and it's going to tear everything in its path down. And there's a much more complicated history with the Omega Men and that character that, again, we won't go into because it's not really here. But it's interesting nonetheless, and it calls a lot back to like Wonder Woman mythology, and it makes a lot of sense to explain those ideas while talking to Donna Troy, who also is connected to that mythology. So as all this is going on, the final battle occurs where it's just Blackfire versus Starfire to the death. And Starfire ultimately wins, but we don't know what happens to Blackfire at the end, and she could very well be alive, which she is, and she'll show up later. But it's a pretty grueling fight, and Blackfire spouts a lot of lies about Starfire's family being dead and such. And at the end of this, Starfire is able to meet her brother and her mother and her father again, and it's a very nice homecoming for all the characters. And now that this control over the system has been broken free by the Teen Titans and by the Omega Men, and Starfire knows her family's okay, everyone's kind of cool to return home again. And so the Titans have finally, for one character, cleared some of their baggage. At least for Starfire, for now, has more control over her emotions, and she's not hung up over the same things as the other Titans are anymore. And so she's kind of on the same footing Cyborg was at the end of the first arc, but Cyborg's kind of gone through more stuff to bring him back to where he was. So that's the second arc, and then finally there's the last two issues, which are 26 and 27, which is a two-part story called Runaways. Now, in the 70s and 80s particularly, Marvel and DC would always partner with social groups and stuff to make comics about issues like drugs. Like there's the famous Batman landmine issue, and handguns and stuff like that. And when it comes to this Runaway story, it's no different. And essentially what happened was that the National Runaway Association came to both Wolfman and Perez and asked them to do a story about runaways. And so that's what this is. It's 2 issues of the Titans coming back to Earth. Robin and Starfire are finally solidifying a relationship with each other. And some of that's actually really interesting, where Robin talks about how he was trained by Batman to not be frightened, to be logical, to be greater. And he talks about how he had the means to get himself there because of Batman and his resources, and other people don't. And so Dick Grayson inherently is always just a little bit afraid, and especially of Starfire, considering her insane amount of power and how she's sort of a force of nature, something that Dick's not really used to. And so those two solidify a relationship, and they bring up some of the tension that Dick Grayson and Batman have been having over in the Batman comic at the same time period. So they finally sort of solidify their relationship, while we cut to a montage of a bunch of teenagers leaving their parents for one reason or another. One kid just wants to go because his parents control him too much. One kid just wants to go because his parent always hurts them, and then one kid is forced to leave because she gets pregnant and her father kicks her out. And we don't follow specifically all of these children, we just kind of go back and forth through groups of runaways, and we essentially deal with these kids on the street forcing to find some sort of income, getting into like prostitution and drugs and stuff like that. And there's this great moment where Raven heals this girl, the girl that gets kicked out for being pregnant. He heals this girl. She heals this girl, and she talks a lot about how inner strength comes from the idea of fighting your own personal demons, and everyone does it differently, which is what makes good or bad people. And it's a side of Raven we never see. We don't see this side of Raven when we talk about the Jeff Johns Titans. We don't see it in the newer stuff. We don't see it in any of the animated shows. We never deal with the fact that Raven is a person that is all about healing people psychologically and absorbing their pain and helping them move forward, and is a complete pacifist. And with just the way she was characterized in both the Teen Titans animated series and in Teen Titans Go, she's not that at all. And I miss those days where Raven's characterization was more about healing and more about acknowledging like social pain that people really can't see, and her being constantly aware of people's own turmoil. And it doesn't have to be physical pain like being hurt, but like emotional baggage and that kind of thing really resonating with her and driving her kind of mad in places. And so that stuff's fantastic. And so the Titans help deal with these runaways. We get a scene where Roy Harper shows back up again as Speedy, and the Titans, along with the district attorney, help break up a operation of drugs. But in doing so, a couple of these teenagers end up dying, and a lot of this is about the fact that runaways do exist, and the fact that social situations have made it so that taking care of these types of children is difficult, and not everyone runs away because they're afraid. Not everyone runs away because of the fact that they refuse to listen to their parents. A lot of times people run away because it's the safest thing for them to do, that it's the sanest thing for them to do, that economically speaking it's better for them, that kids are not just childish and emotional, that they're really dealing with a certain kind of pain that's difficult to find a concrete solution to. Like, by the end of this, the girl that's pregnant goes back to her father, and she still gets kicked out. She can't stay. And that's the end of the story. That's the end of her arc, is she gets kicked out for being pregnant, she turns to prostitution, she gets beat, Raven heals her, she goes back home, and her father still kicks her out. And there's no happy ending to that. It's an actual issue, and it's an actual problem that not a lot of solutions exist for. Like, what could she realistically do? And I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of things here and there we can list, like social services and Planned Parenthood, and like, there are things now governmentally that we can talk about, that we can use to address her specific need, but then just factor in the fact that she still loves her father, and that she doesn't really want a child, and that a lot of this was a mistake, and that she is young and vulnerable, and that a lot of the more complex solutions have consequences that would go over the head of a kid, of someone that is just 16 or 17. And sometimes it's heated emotion, and sometimes it's just misunderstanding, and sometimes it's something you can't control. And a lot of that gets handled really well here, and the Teen Titans even talk about the fact that all of them are in their 20s, despite the fact that their name is Teen Titans. And so they're in a place where they're able to better deal with these issues and talk to these kids, but they're not in a place where they can necessarily give them the perfect answer either. So that's really interesting. This is the largest leap forward for this book. And the next story arc we're going to talk about involves Tara. Tara has her first appearance in one of the final issues here in number 26. Her and Changeling meet up with each other, and Tara is told to attack a certain location, but Changeling shows up and messes with that, and so she has to run away, and she's clearly very scared and clearly being extorted into doing this. But then, of course, we know where a lot of that goes eventually if you've read Terra Incognito and the Judas Contract. So that's where all of this is building to. But that's Volume 4. I don't know if it's the best yet. I really like a lot of where this is going. I love the Brother Blood story. The stuff with the Gordanians and Tamaran and stuff in the middle is interesting, but the character stuff is more interesting than the space opera story itself. A lot of that Teen Titans wise just kind of bores me, even though a lot of it is legitimately interesting, and you do so much both with Starfire and Raven's characters, and then the Runaway stuff is just as social commentary, really well handled. So this is really good. It's probably not the best volume yet, but of these 4, it's certainly better than 2, or it's certainly better than 3, and it's probably better than 1. It's probably there with Volume 2, where we're dealing more concretely with some of these issues and addressing character dynamics and such. This is really good. If you want to start reading Teen Titans, Volume 3 would be a good place to start. You don't have to necessarily go back to 1, but if you don't care about character origin, then this is not a bad place to start either. I think at this point, every story arc is a pretty good jumping on point. And a lot of the more familiar stuff is about to come in the next volume, so it might be beneficial to start around Volume 3 or 4 if you don't want to buy all of them. But thanks everybody for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. What do you think of this particular volume, or any of these story arcs, or any of these characters that first appear? Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.